Hi, Bobby. Thanks for joining me this morning.
Hiya there.
Hi. So can you introduce yourself and tell everyone a little bit about the work that you do and your research?
Yeah, so I'm currently undertaking a PhD in something that's called digital civics at Open Lab, just up the road at Newcastle University. Um, it's an interdisciplinary research lab that is trying to address these kind of big societal challenges we face using digital technologies. Um, so my particular research focuses on how technologies can facilitate community-led place visioning, as well as reimaginations of the futures of the many underused, underloved, or often underappreciated spaces, particularly in Teesside. So before my PhD, I gained a master's in urban planning and spent some time working as an urban planner in London, as well as various other kind of non-planning related jobs abroad for a couple of years when I was living in Catalonia. Um, but I've always had a passion for Teesside, and have followed, kind of the various grand attempts over the years to do kind of large scale regeneration. So when I came to do my PhD, I wanted to ensure that I carried out as much of my research here on Teesside at home as possible, exploring how we could kind of tackle some of these kind of big urban planning issues in our area, and understand why often we fail to, regenerate our area. Um, I think probably one of the things that fascinates me most is our area's kind of unique and often contested identity, as sometimes like it's sometimes even like a mythical place that exists like in the hearts and minds of people, rather than it actually being like a physical place that you can actually define on a map. So like, for example, if you type in Teesside on Google Maps, and you won't actually find a place. There's no defined boundaries, and there's that constant contestation between, are we Teesside? Are we Cleveland? Are we the Tees Valley? Are we County Durham, North Yorkshire? Are we unity authorities? And I've been always been interested in that kind of this like peculiar dynamic, and we have in like relation to our place identity, and also how that affects how our area has developed over time, and also probably the way we are perceived and often misunderstood externally, but also how this kind of identity crisis affects how we perceive ourselves as well. And I think it's often the physical landmarks that we attach ourselves to, and that define us as Teesside, and which is probably why I think I've always been of the belief that good quality public spaces, that are embedded in communities that reflect the people of the place, the history, the heritage of those places, are key to how we make towns and cities better. We only need to like look at the recent debate around saving the Transport Bridge as a working structure, and that emotive response that has people have had from local residents, and how that is kind of affected. It affects everyone, even though it is just it's a piece of steel at the end of the day, but it is so much a part of our identity, and who we are. So my research it's kind of based around the idea that too often we see these grand plans for regeneration of the many kind of derelict sites across our area, of which there are many, that promise so much, but they never actually come to fruition. And I often feel like we're fighting for the scraps from other areas of the UK, and sometimes we feel like we're kind of somehow not worthy of that investment, particularly in the arts and our heritage. And we would often lose out to our neighbours just because of internal fighting, or of this discussion of kind of whataboutism of let's not spend the money on that. What about, we've got this problem, we've got that problem. But if we don't collectively appreciate, you know, our uniqueness and our identity and the importance of public spaces, you know, we will always lose out to other areas. So as part of my research, I've just begun collaborating with a couple of grassroots organisations who want to create that kind of forum for discussion on alternative futures for underused spaces in Teesside, and as well as like support kind of this community-led placemaking efforts to build the, you know, to create a better built environment in our area.
Well, terrific. That was amazing. It's quite a journey there. So I've been in a few of these sessions with you, and I find it really exciting, really, really important work. Obviously, I'm kind of trained as a community organizer, so really kind of that's made me thinking, you know, in small terms, like tiny little things that you can do that can actually make a big difference. So it's great to play with ideas like, you know, what if we got rid of the flyover that should never have been built? What if we could rechannel the Tees through the centre of Middlesbrough? You know, these kinds of just outrageous ideas. And I suppose you can have them when you're working digitally, because you can just kind of imagine that, you know, without some major groundworks going on. So can you talk a little bit about like your Pinterest board and the way that you've been working with some local artists to reimagine, you know, not things quite that ridiculous, but things that could be done, the way that art could be used around the town of Middlesbrough?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, certainly it's definitely, it's an interesting point about, you know, asking these quite, you know, very provocative questions of quite outlandish things of, you know, what if we did get rid of the A66, what, you know, and we, whether we tunneled it or just got rid of it completely and said, you know, we're not going to encourage car travel. But what could that space become, and how could it actually transform the centre of Middlesbrough? And we know that the chances of that happening are very unlikely, but it's the questions and the ideas that come from that we could then appropriate for other uses in other parts of the town. So going back to the kind of the Pinterest board and the kind of the collaborations that I've just begun working on. One of these groups is called Reimagining Borough. So the idea is that they're attempting to bring together community organisations, artists, local residents to do that, to challenge the way we think about and use public spaces in Middlesbrough and reimagine what the town could look like in the future. So these things could be these kind of grand plans that may never come to fruition, and how they can kind of support us to rethink and maybe change our perceptions of underused spaces in Teesside. But also it's about the kind of small scale interventions that we can do here and now with little resources that can again change the perceptions of place and just give places a more, you know, reactivate them and bring them to what, you know, what we had, not kind of leaning too much on nostalgia, because we can't be looking back, we need to be looking forward. But there is always those elements whenever you see any new plans or any photos of the way our streets are today, there's always these kind of groups and historical photos to say, oh, what a shame it's not like it used to be and everything like that. And it's about reimagining, okay, we might not have what we had then, but what can we do with the little resources we have to reimagine these spaces and make them more bright and beautify them and everything like that. So one of the key kind of elements of that work is exploring how we can use ideas such as creative placemaking and tactical urbanism to transform these underused spaces. So that's all about kind of how we can, you know, how can we activate the spaces and encourage usage, often through artist installations and just public realm improvements generally. So the idea being that these kind of installing small scale, cheap and quick improvements to places, we can understand how we can use them better in the future, and how this kind of short-term change can influence an overall long-term and more permanent change in the future, whether that's changing local residents' perceptions of a space that, okay, this space is actually safe to go to, or if it is changing, or visitors, for example, if they come into central Middlesbrough, they arrive at the station, and instead of seeing a load of derelict buildings that have been sat there for 10 years, how can we reappropriate them for meanwhile uses for, you know, small amounts of time to activate them? But it also could be how we could change kind of the way local councils plan places, and how they're stuck in these long processes of we don't have the time or the money to invest in these types of things. How can we actually maybe, what if we painted a cycle lane through the centre of Middlesbrough for a 2-week period to see if people used it, instead of actually putting that big expensive infrastructure in and actually building that cycle lane, testing these ideas out before you actually have to invest the money. I think a great example of that is a project called Parking Day from San Francisco, which was a group of artists and designers came together, and they occupied just one small parking space in the city for a day. And instead of parking a car there, they came along and they put like a little bit of turf down, a little bit of artificial grass, a couple of benches and some flowers, and they turned it into a mini park. And of course, this improved kind of like the look and the feel of the street, and made it more safe, and made people want to kind of linger in that space, made it more inviting. But it also brought kind of to attention the issues of our, reliance on cars, and the need for more accessible green spaces in the city. So as part of that reimagining borough work, we're trying to explore some of these kind of innovative ideas and create a discussion around how we could maybe co-create a network of spaces in the town that could benefit from these types of urban interventions, or whether it's creating a movement to actually make people realize that they can actually make changes in their towns and cities. And this movement, could we start something off small, like the alleyway makeovers and those small things, and they kind of fan out across the whole of Middlesbrough. So one of the things we've set up at the moment is a Pinterest board to share ideas and gain inspiration from projects like Parking Day in San Francisco, and kind of maybe categorize those and understand those different types of interventions that we as community organizers, or as artists, or as just local residents, we can use to transform Middlesbrough, basically.
Brilliant. I think it's a really inspiring project. And yeah, I think with things like the alleyway schemes, and now the car park that's being reclaimed and turning into somewhere to grow food,
yeah.
At the auxiliary, I think that gives people like a way into understanding what you're doing, because it's like, kind of quite a huge, a really, really exciting project. And if you just think of it into, just one alleyway reclaimed and turned from, somewhere where, as you say, areas that people might be afraid to go or just aren't nice to go. And then suddenly it becomes like, they're talking about them being like outdoor living rooms.
Mm-hmm.
It's a space, and it builds community and love of where you live, and respect for where you live. And, just imagining what could happen if you applied that to the whole of Teesside, and what could be achieved. And as you say, it's like, there's such a sense of competition these days for what, if you can't have that, if you can have that, just the freedom to say, well, let's put all that thinking aside and think in ideal terms. And if money wasn't an option, and if everybody was on board, what would you like? What would you do? And then seeing how we make that move from here to there.
Yeah. I mean, it's about taking action first and just seeing where it goes. and, you know, just putting these kind of provocative questions out there, these provocative visuals, and seeing if that does ignite a discussion, and if it does start these movements. And often it's about making, you know, a lot of people don't realize the amount of underused spaces there is in places like central Middlesbrough that are just never used, and how the amount of potential these spaces have. Just for example, kind of like service alleys at the back of shopping centres, or, you know, like Albert Mews, Linthorpe Mews, all of these kind of big, long service alleys that, you know, are just full of, you know, rubbish, and, you know, and not inviting places to go, but how these could be alternative public spaces for people, you know, whether it be that creates that kind of, you know, intimate atmosphere with, you know, places for artists to, you know, experiment with murals and stuff like that, or whether it's more commercial uses, having like small cafes and bars for independent businesses. You know, there's so much potential for that in Teesside, and so many examples from around the world that we could appropriate, that doesn't need to cost the earth, but could have really big, you know, a really big impact on how we, you know, use our spaces, and also how we perceive them.
Absolutely, and you know, particularly being involved in the performing arts, and at the moment with all the uncertainty about coronavirus and all of that, it does seem for the foreseeable that really outdoors is going to be the performance space, and I'm really interested in looking at ad hoc places to perform. So it's really exciting to think about all the unused, underused spaces that we could inhabit and turn into, you know, our clubs, our theatres, and yeah, I just find it a really exciting project, and it's always a real pleasure to talk to you. I won't take up any more of your time because I know you've got all kind of marking and stuff to do. This has been great, and of course I'll put up all the contact details of where people can get involved when I put the interview on YouTube.
Great, thanks a lot.
Thanks ever so much, Bobby. That was great.
Cheers.